You could say the Beatles went from singing love songs to becoming enemies of the state faster than you could say come together. But it wasn't really about the whole band. It was about one particular member who scared the hell out of the Nixon administration. Here's why John Lennon from the Beatles became America's most wanted musician. Before we get on to the real stuff, let's talk about how incompetent the FBI actually was at tracking John Lennon. The FBI gathered more than 300 pieces of intelligence about the former Beatle, but they couldn't even get his face right. At some point during their investigation, the Bureau produced a wanted poster of Lennon. The only problem? The photo they used wasn't even him. It was actually David Peel, a folk singer and street performer from the East Village. The mix-up happened because the photo was from an album cover that Lennon had produced called The Pope Smokes Dope. Think about that. John Lennon was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, and the FBI mistook him for a local busker. As historian John Weiner later put it, the agents were more Keystone cops than the Gestapo. Maybe it was lucky for Lennon that the people hunting him were so clueless. Now, you might wonder what exactly made a Beatle so dangerous that the government felt the need to spy on him. It all started with a song, but not one you'd expect. In December of 1971, Lennon sang at a rally for John Sinclair of the White Panthers, who was serving a 10-year sentence for selling 2 joints. The John Sinclair Freedom Rally was held on December 10, 1971 in the Chrysler Arena at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The FBI began viewing Lennon as a potential security threat in late 1971, after he attracted approximately 15,000 plus people to a University of Michigan rally to free political activist John Sinclair. Lennon even wrote an original song specifically for the concert, titled John Sinclair. What really got the government attention though was that the rally actually worked. Within 72 hours of the concert, Sinclair was released from prison, and the Michigan legislature even reformed the state's marijuana laws. Suddenly, the fans realized that this ex-Beatle had real political power. But the surveillance didn't really kick into high gear because of one concert. In 1971, the FBI put John Lennon under surveillance because of his anti-war activities. The Nixon administration was terrified that Lennon would try to use his massive influence to swing the 1972 election. Why were they so worried? Well, the 72 election was going to be the first in which 18-year-olds had the right to vote. And guess who had millions of young fans? The guy who wrote Give Peace a Chance. The FBI worried that Lennon and Ono were planning a large rock concert to be held in front of the convention hall in Miami Beach, where the Republican National Convention was to be held. Imagine the President of the United States losing sleep over the possibility of a rock concert. But that's exactly what happened. In April of 1972, Hoover sent a memo to the New York FBI office stating Lennon should be arrested, if at all possible, on possession of narcotics charges. They were actively trying to neutralize him. When surveillance wasn't enough, the Nixon administration decided to play dirty. In 1972, approximately a year after his move to New York in 1971, the INS attempted to deport John Sinclair on a fabricated drug charge. Immigration law at that time banned anyone with a drug offense from entering the US, so they figured they had him cornered. The deportation proceedings started in 1972, right around the time of the Republican National Convention. Coincidence? Not a chance. But the thing that saved Lennon was that Nixon got himself deported from the White House first. Once Watergate took down the president, the heat on Lennon suddenly cooled off. During this whole mess, Lennon became increasingly paranoid. And honestly, he had every right to be. He started talking publicly about how people kept coming to fix phones and how there were strange men outside in suits following him around. Documents that came out years later proved that he wasn't being paranoid at all. He was being watched. You might think that the government was overreacting to a musician, but they had their reasons. Nixon and many of his allies were truly afraid that Lennon was preaching radical ideals through his music. Songs like Imagine weren't just popular, they were becoming anthems for a generation that was already turning against the war and the establishment. Lennon wasn't shy about his political views either. He gave interviews to socialist publications and talked openly about being against the status quo and very conscious of class. When you're trying to win over young voters, having the most influential musician of the era speaking against your policies is a nightmare scenario. The FBI couldn't actually prove that Lennon was a communist or a Marxist, but that didn't stop them from trying to paint him as one. They included his song lyrics as evidence of his revolutionary and proletarian leanings. Imagine being investigated by the feds for writing songs about peace and love. It took historian John Weiner 14 years of legal battles to get the FBI to release the Lennon files. The first two parts of this release consist of previously released material from investigations that mention Lennon's connection to anti-war and related groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The final documents weren't released until 2006. When Mark Rosenbaum from the ACLU finally got to review the files, he had this to say, quote, "The release of these final documents, concealed from public view for nearly a quarter of a century, reveal government paranoia at a pathological level. What's crazy is that most of the 300 pages was just the FBI talking about Lennon having revolutionary ideals and quoting his song lyrics. They paid informants to attend his concerts and speeches, but never found any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The whole investigation was basically the US government being terrified of a guy who sang about peace." The truth is, the FBI's plan to catch Lennon revolved around a theory that he and his friends were planning a Get Out the Vote concert tour to recruit newly eligible voters. They figured if they could keep him busy with deportation hearings, he wouldn't have time to organize against Nixon. And you know what? It worked. The planned concerts never happened because Lennon was too focused on staying in the country. Nixon got exactly what he wanted without having to arrest anybody. The FBI outsourced informants, paying them to spy on Lennon by attending his concerts and speeches. This wasn't a new tactic. They'd done the same thing to cultural icons like Charlie Chaplin and Pablo Picasso. But with Lennon, they were essentially treating it like a crime to sing Give Peace a Chance. When John Weiner finally published his book, Give Me Some Truth, The John Lennon FBI Files in February 2000, it revealed just how paranoid the US government had become. The document showed that Nixon's goal was simple: keep Lennon from swaying voters in the 1972 election. Here's the timeline that proves it. The FBI investigation began in January 1972, right before the Republican National Convention, where Nixon was expected to get re-elected. Once Nixon was re-elected in November of the same year, the FBI closed its investigation on Lennon. Pretty convenient timing, don't you think? Correspondence from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to Nixon's chief of staff confirmed that the White House was directly involved in Lennon's surveillance. This wasn't some rogue operation, it was coming straight from the top. The declassified documents suggest a level of unnecessary paranoia by the US government that would make even conspiracy theorists blush. As Dan Marvalevsky from the ACLU put it, "From the beginning, the FBI treated John Lennon as if it were a crime to sing Give Peace a Chance." The whole saga finally ended when Nixon left office in disgrace. Lennon eventually won his battle to stay in the US, but the damage was done. He spent years looking over his shoulders, afraid to speak out, afraid to organize, afraid to use his platform for political causes. In 2006, the same year the final FBI documents were released, a documentary called The US vs. John Lennon came out, detailing the entire ordeal. It showed how a government that claimed to stand for freedom was willing to destroy someone's life just for singing songs about peace. Maybe the most telling thing about this whole story is about what it says about power. Here was the most powerful government in the world with the world's largest military and intelligence apparatus, and they were terrified of one guy with a guitar. That's either the greatest compliment ever paid to the power of music, or the most damning indictment of how insecure our leaders really were. So if the US government was willing to spy on and try and deport one of the world's most famous musicians for just singing about peace, what does that say about how they treat regular citizens who speak out against the system today? Now consider liking the video and subscribe to our channel for more explosive contents that we'll be soon bringing out.